Hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box, where today I want to ask what is Steely Dan? Not who or anything like that, but what? And the reason is because there might not be as clear an answer as you might think. Are they a band? Well, they were for their first few albums, in terms of a band with semi-regular members, but even that was kind of fast and loose because a lot of different people passed through it. And so they weren't really a solid unit as a band. Is Steely Dan a concept? Well, yes, it is, but at the same time, there is a defined duo of collaborators, songwriters, and sort of ringleaders of the project. So it's a bit more than that. Is Steely Dan a studio collective? Maybe that's getting a bit closer to the truth. But the fact of the matter is, at various times, they have been all of these things at one time or another. When they first rose to prominence in around 72 with the album Can't Buy a Thrill, the intention was for them to be a band, and this continued through their second album, which is one of my very favorites, Countdown to Ecstasy, up through Pretzel Logic. But increasingly, they withdrew from the road and became a studio-only band. And they did that, I think, for the following reasons. There was some talk of Donald Fagen, who, along with Walter Becker, are Steely Dan, the two of them. But there were, I think, more fundamental and more artistic reasons that they chose to do it. When the Beatles made a similar decision in the mid 60s, they did so because the PA systems at that time, in the early 60s, early mid 60s, weren't really advanced enough to project over the screaming in these large auditoriums. By the 70s, that was no problem at all. PAs had become very sophisticated and certainly very powerful in terms of the wattage. So I think it was more something else. I think that they wanted to craft their compositions around unique groups of musicians where not only each song would have a bespoke, unique, original set of musicians on it, but even segments of individual songs. So, for instance, let's have the opening song being drummed by Bernie Taupin. Let's have the second part by Bernard Purdy. What am I talking about? See, I'm having a Joe Biden moment. Let's have the first part drummed by Bernard Purdy, the second by Steve Gadd, and etc. Let's have a guitar solo here from Larry Carlton. Let's then have Walter Becker come in with his guitar. All of these different concepts. And so by the time that they reached their sort of transitional stage, a lot of interesting things will happen. And I would put one of my other very favorite albums, possibly my favorite, The Royal Scam, as that transition period between them sort of kind of acting like a band, but also getting into this mode of having very interesting session players and very famous soloists in their own right come in, to a fully fledged commitment to say, look, we're not operating under the pretenses of a band. We're strictly a studio band, and we're going to get the top jazz, session, funk, soul, and any other genre that you will type of musician onto these records. Each track will have a different cost. As I said, some tracks will even vary a bit from beginning to end. And this sort of setup that I'm referring to really came to life on the 77 album Asia, which many AJA, funny spelling. That's really thought of as the quintessential Steely Dan album by most. And then their final album of their classic period came out in 1980, and this was Gaucho. It followed that same sort of arrangement format of Asia in terms of different musicians from all of these walks of life, famous jazz soloists, hard-hitting studio guys, and of course, Becker and Fagen as well. And then the band went away for well over 10 years. Donald Fagen, a few years into the 80s, around about 83, released his Nightfly album, which was kind of like a Steely Dan album, but a bit more song orientated and less in terms of solo. But then it was on this day in 1993 that they kind of became a band again. They started going out on the road with wonderful musicians around them. And I think by now, several things, and by now I mean by the 90s, several things had happened. Uh, I think that Becker and Fagan, as they were approaching middle age, had calmed down a bit. And while they were always known as perfectionists, perfectionists to the core. I mean, if they were to do a silly little YouTube channel, they'd probably make several attempts at a video rather than just wing it, which is what I do here on this channel. But they were perfectionists, and this was emblematic of the way that they recorded, the way that they selected musicians, the way that they did multiple takes, sometimes with different musicians, and the way that they were very meticulous in how they mixed the albums, which is why Steely Dan albums have always been favorites among the audiophile community. And now, as some of you know, there's a big reissue campaign where Bernie Grundman is remastering all of the albums, most from the original master tape, and these are coming out on as digital downloads, streaming across all of the streaming services and SACDs. And for those who are really fanatical, you can get the 45 RPM double LP versions from Acoustic Sounds. For the people who want the ultimate vinyl experience, they're not paying me to say that, but it is very good stuff. You could argue that it's never sounded better, although there really hasn't been any bad Steely Dan pressings. The first record pressing sounded really good. The first CD pressing sounded really good. The Citizen Steely Dan Complete Works box set from 1993, mastered by Glenn Meadows, I do believe, that sounds really good if you ask me. Then in 1999, we're going to party like it, Roger Nichols remastered everything again. Some say those are a bit on the hot side, but the Bernie Grundman stuff from the last year or so is a bit on the cooler side. So I think the Citizen stuff is in between, but you can't really go wrong one way or another. So back to 1993. What had changed? I think that people became a bit less judgmental of live music. The 60s, 70s, and even into the 80s, audiences really demanded a lot of bang for their $5. I mean, it was heady times, where by 1993, things had become a lot more expensive, though not like they are today, but people were more willing to forgive. And I think that might have eased the stage fright thing. I think that the fact that Steely Dan had become such a legendary name by then, that they were comfortable with asking top musicians from the world of jazz and others to do these live tours. And this continued right up until a few years back when Walter Becker sadly died. They recorded obviously new albums in the 90s and into the 2000s, which were widely acclaimed, though not as favorited among fans as the golden 70s period. If I had to recommend which Steely Dan album to listen to first, and they didn't record so many albums, like a Zappa figure, that it's hard to go through the category, I would say probably start with Aisha and Gaucho, because that is when most people agree they reached their peak. But after that, I would say Royal Scam and Countdown to Ecstasy, because those have some really catchy songs performed very well on them. So, answering the question, what is Steely Dan? I would say that it was two men with a love of jazz, and they loved jazz so much that they started a fake rock band that became a place, a name where jazz aficionados would congregate to play their music. And when I say a fake band, I don't mean they were playing their instruments, but they never really were a rock band. So in that sense, it was fake rock, but something that was approaching real jazz. Make of that what you will. Like, subscribe. We'll see you next time. Take care.